Chapter 2346. Chinmu couldn't stand it anymore. She ignored him and reached out to tidy up the bottles and cans. He didn't let go and breathed hot air on the back of her neck. Mumu, love me, okay? I can't control that. Chinmu paused for a moment. Hey, I love you. He frowned. It sounds insincere. Chinmu looked at him and snorted. Zhou Chengguang, from the day you cheated on me, don't expect my love anymore. After she finished speaking, not only him but she was also a little stunned. Then there was a long silence which made her feel a little sad. Zhou Chengguang was the same. The heartache hidden in his heart came out again. He hugged her tightly from behind and pressed his face against hers, not allowing her to refuse. Mumu, I know it's my fault. I made you angry. If I see them in the future I'll walk around them, okay? Chinmu pursed her lips and didn't say anything. She was a little embarrassed. She felt that she had been making a scene because she cared about him, but at this time he had discovered her thoughts. Zhou Chengguang stared at her side profile and coaxed, "Why aren't you saying anything, huh?" Chinmu suddenly stood up. "I'm hungry." Zhou Chengguang chuckled in a low voice. "I'll go get something to eat." Now that she was covered in red marks, she probably wouldn't go downstairs. Chinmu didn't say anything. She lay on the sofa and read a book. He gazed deeply at her, thinking this can be considered as reconciling. After Zhou Chengguang left, Chinmu was a little confused. She habitually went to the cabinet. She had already taken the medicine today, but she seemed to have some kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder. When she saw the medicine she would feel more at ease. When she unscrewed the cap and took a look, she was a little stunned. There was more medicine. Chinmu poured out all the pills and counted them one by one. She was a person with obsessive-compulsive disorder, so she knew how many pills there were. It was obviously different from before. She looked at it, then opened the other cabinets, rummaged inside and out, and finally found a medicine bottle. To be precise, it was a bottle of vitamins. She opened it, poured out the vitamins inside and counted them. More than 10 of the 100 pills were missing. She looked at it again and compared it with the medicine in her bottle. It was exactly the same. The medicine bottle in his hand fell to the ground. All this while she had been taking vitamins and not birth control pills. While Chinmu was in a daze, Zhou Chengguang was standing at the door with her lunch and dinner in his hands. Looking at the vitamins scattered all over the floor, he knew that he had been exposed. He said calmly, "I've always wanted a child." "When did it start?" Chinmu's voice was a little hoarse. Zhou Chengguang pursed his lips slightly. "It started in Yunnan." "Mumu, it's not for my mother, but..." He slowly walked in, put the things aside and gently hugged her. "I want to be with you forever." As he spoke, his voice was a little suppressed and trembling. He was actually afraid that she would be angry. He was afraid that she would be angry. Chinmu raised her face and looked at him quietly. "What if I still don't love you again? Zhou Chengguang, do you want our child to be born under such circumstances?" "No." He hugged her and said softly, "I will give him a lot of love and I will give you more love. Mumu, trust me once." Chapter 2347. Chinmu was trapped in his arms and couldn't say a word. It wasn't that she wasn't tempted. And he seemed to feel her tempted as well. He hugged her tighter and said in a hotter voice, "Let's not use contraception. Let's make love all the time and get pregnant, okay?" Chinmu bit her lip and said in a trembling voice, "What if I can't get pregnant?" Zhou Chengguang's heart tightened. He knew that he had softened at this moment, so he was extremely excited. He bit her little ear and said in a hoarse voice, "Mrs. Zhou, are you questioning your husband's ability?" He reached out and carried her to the bed, kissing and rubbing her as he walked. "Let's do it now, okay?" Chinmu screamed, her voice trembling. "Zhou Chengguang, you're crazy." She had never known that he had such a strong desire. It was simply terrible. In the blink of an eye, he had already pressed her down and kissed her. Chinmu's body softened and she let him kiss her for a while before she pursed her lips and said, "Zhou Chengguang, I'm hungry." Her voice was a little pitiful. Chinmu had never acted coquettishly with him like this, which was very rare for him. He stared at her with his dark eyes and said with a faint smile, "Mumu, say that again?" Chinmu bit her lip and said softly, "I'm hungry. Can we eat first?" However, he deliberately twisted her words and said with a faint smile, "Okay, let's eat first." Chinmu couldn't stand his shamelessness and turned her face away. Shameless. However, he loved her shy look very much. He reached out and gently touched her little face, his eyes incredibly gentle. She didn't move. She just tilted her little face, soft and fragrant. He was a man, a mature man with strong desires. She was like this, so he naturally desired it. He leaned forward and kissed the corner of her mouth for a long time, but he was obviously restraining himself. After kissing for a long time, he only kissed her lips, not even deeply. Finally, he had kissed enough and let go of her. His voice was low and husky. Time to eat. Qin Mu lay down softly and did not get up. Zhou Chongguang bit her little face. You want a hug? Qin Mu looked at him pitifully and did not say anything. His heart was incredibly soft. He reached out and gently hugged her. You're getting smaller and smaller. However, he liked it when she was like this. Hugging her in his arms, he gently asked her what she wanted to eat and carefully fed her. In his arms, Qin Mu nibbled on the softness that she had never felt before. Zhou Chongguang felt that her heart was about to melt. It was an indescribable feeling. In short, she felt that the entire world was filled with Qin Mu. He continued to feed her and ate some himself. When he sent the tray downstairs, his eyes were full of smiles. The servants in the house were a little silent because Mr. Zhou and Miss had been locked in the bedroom for a whole day and had not come out yet. Zhou Chongguang stood still and said calmly, "Don't come out tonight." The servants were stunned. Then they looked at Mr. Zhou with a meaningful gaze. Mr. Zhou was really amazing. After Zhou Chongguang said that, he went upstairs slowly. However, it was not like what the servants thought. He carried Qin Mu downstairs and placed her on the sofa. He wrapped a blanket around her and played the piano for her the whole night. Qin Mu wrapped herself in the blanket and sat beside him. She placed her hands on the piano keys and played along with him. Chapter 23:48. Then he picked her up with one hand and put her in his arms. He rested his chin on her shoulder and said, "You play." He hugged her, and as he hugged her, he became a little unruly. Qin Mu cried out in a low voice, her voice trembling like a little beast. Zhou Chongguang. He was crazy. This was the hall and someone could come over at any time. Qin Mu struggled, but the more she struggled, the more unbearable the situation became. He bit her shoulder and said in a low voice, "Be good, keep your voice down. Someone will come over." Qin Mu was almost going crazy. She bit her lip and didn't dare to make a sound, but the more she suppressed it, the more difficult it was for her to control herself. She was extremely fragile and he was strong and gentle. The sound of the piano was out of tune and extremely messy. It was just like their entangled bodies. After a long time, he finally let her go. He kissed the side of her face and called her name. "Mumu, are you okay?" Qin Mu shrank into his arms and cried softly. He knew that he had gone too far. She was such a shy little thing, but he had forced her to do it in the hall. Although the servants in the house were all old and it was not a big deal for a couple to do it in the living room, Qin Mu still couldn't let it go. She bit her lip and grabbed his shoulder with her little hand. She said in a low voice, "I want to go upstairs." He chuckled, kissed her forehead and carried her upstairs. When Qin Mu was lying on the bed, she was a little angry and ignored him. Zhou Chongguang chuckled and leaned over to coax her. "Are you angry?" Qin Mu had her back to him. "No." He looked at her little head and kissed her hair. "Are you shy?" Qin Mu's voice was a little angry. "No. Mumu," he said with a smile, "it's nothing for a husband and wife to do it in the living room." As he spoke, his voice became hot again. "The servants in the house shouldn't make a fuss." He spoke for a long time before Qin Mu suddenly whispered, "Zhou Chongguang, I'm not used to it. Would you like to do it in the bedroom or the bathroom?" He continued to ask. Qin Mu couldn't stand it, so she turned around and bit his chin. Zhou Chongguang smiled, and it was a very meaningful smile. He thought they should be considered reconciled. From that day on, with Qin Mu's tacit consent, Zhou Chongguang worked hard to sow seeds. He wanted to have a child as soon as possible. Qin Mu also felt it. Although it was a little tiring to deal with him during the day and night, she did not resist. In the following period of time, they got along the best. He did as he said. He didn't go out to eat or socialize and came back early to accompany her. However, more than half a month later, Qin Mu's period came. She stared blankly, her emotions somewhat complicated. She didn't know if she wanted to get pregnant or if she didn't want to. Walking out of the bathroom, Zhou Chongguang was leaning against the headboard, wearing only a bathrobe. He was holding a magazine in his hand and reading it casually. She knew that he was waiting for her to make love. She pursed her lower lip, pulled the collar of her pajamas and slowly walked over to lie down beside him. As soon as she lay down, Zhou Chengguang immediately put down the magazine in his hand, held her little face with his big palm and kissed her. After kissing for a while, he slightly withdrew, still kissing the corner of her mouth, and murmured, "Why were you gone for so long?" Chapter 2349. Zhou Chengguang was stunned for a moment, then he smiled and bit her nose. "I really want to do it, huh?" Qin Mu turned her face away and bit her lips. "Zhou Chengguang, I'm not pregnant. If you're not pregnant, we'll try again next month." He helped her lie down and carefully placed her in his arms. His voice was gentle. "Mumu, don't be pressured. We're still young. We'll have children." Qin Mu nestled in his arms and didn't say a word. After a long time she said softly, "Zhou Chengguang, do you like boys or girls?" Zhou Chengguang smiled and pinched her face. "I like Mumu." "You're not serious." She kissed him and closed her eyes to sleep. However, the man leaned over and held her hand. "I've waited for you for so long. If you sleep now, what should I do?" Qin Mu's little face rested on his shoulder and she bit him lightly. "What do you want then?" "Help me." He spat out these two words softly. Qin Mu raised his eyes and looked at him silently. Then he blushed and lay in his arms. His little hand broke free from his big palm. 10,000 words were omitted. Zhou Chengguang took a deep breath. He had never thought that a girl like Qin Mu would be willing to help him like this. However, this was the first time after their marriage that they felt like they were in love with each other. It was no longer a one-sided effort, but a cooperation between the two of them. Late at night, the love became stronger. The next day, Qin Mu went back to the Qin family. Zhou Chengguang accompanied her back. To her surprise, Yi Muyun brought Cher and Xiao Yishu back as well. What made Qin Mu the most unacceptable was that Xiao Yishu was a girl, and her brother knew it, but now he was wearing a suit again. However, Qin Mu didn't ask for the time being. She just observed Cher's reaction in the Qin family. She seemed to have really forgotten everything. She had forgotten how she had been hurt and how she had been separated from her brother. Qin Mu felt a little sad when she saw how careful she was and how she was even trying to please her brother. Now, the way Cher and her brother got along seemed to have returned to the time when she was afraid of her brother. Was this the way Big Brother wanted them to get along? Qin Mu and Zhou Chengguang sat on the sofa together facing Cher. Zhou Chengguang was quite calm. In the past he had indeed treated Tang Shuiger as a goddess. He had also directly caused the separation between Tang Shuiger and Yi Muyun. But now he had let it go. He felt a little guilty to Cher, but a man was different from a woman. He wouldn't lose his happiness because of guilt. This was the difference between him and Qin Mu. Snow flashed them a faint smile as if it were nothing out of the ordinary. Qin Mu smiled back and looked around. She remembered that 8 years ago she and Cher were upstairs talking about their feelings, and her young girl's feelings hurt Cher. She was a little absent-minded, even a little absent-minded. Zhou Chengguang reached out to hold her cold little hand and said in a low voice, "Guilt can't help yourself or others at any time." Qin Mu looked at him sideways. Zhou Chengguang smiled and clenched his fingers. "You can be friends with her again." Qin Mu's eyes seemed to be lit up with countless little stars. She looked at Zhou Chengguang just like that. At this time he was her faith, like a drowning person meeting a driftwood. All these years Cher had been a thorn in her heart. And she was incurable. She looked at Zhou Chengguang and the corners of her mouth curled up slightly. Chapter 2350. She thought that since he had let it go, it was time for her to let it go as well. Zhou Chengguang was right. Guilt couldn't help anyone. Qin Mu took some time to look for Yi Muyun. He was playing with Xiao Yishu in the yard. Apart from the suit jacket, the little girl was lying on the lawn looking for something. Qin Mu walked over slowly and stood side by side with her brother. After looking at Xiao Yishu for a while, she couldn't help but say, "Brother, Yishu is a girl." Yi Muyun glanced at her and said expressionlessly, "I know. Then why do you let her continue to dress like this?" Qin Mu couldn't help but ask. "Brother, this will have a huge impact on Yishu's sexual orientation." After she said that, Yi Muyun tilted his head and looked at her slowly. He sighed. "Do you think I don't want to?" Qin Mu looked at him with a puzzled look in her eyes. Yi Muyun sighed. "Yishu doesn't want to and Cher is protective. I can't do anything about it. He had always been helpless when it came to them, especially when they cried. It was killing him. As he said that, he laughed bitterly and looked at Qin Mu. Think about it, ever since Shui'er was young, what have I not been able to satisfy her? Although he was quite fierce to her, he really gave in to her in almost everything. Qin Mu was still a little shocked. She didn't care about other things, but when it came to Xiao Yishu's sexual orientation, her brother also gave in to share. She looked at Yi Muyun for a long time, looking at his helpless face. Qin Mu was really convinced. It couldn't be her brother, right? Her voice was very low. Is this how it will be from now on? Mr. Yu was also very helpless. He looked at his sister. Let's see how it goes. If she really likes it, there's nothing we can do about it. At that moment he almost wanted to kill Lan Yu. His precious little sweetheart was a little yellow bun, but now she had turned into a flower. But this didn't stop him from doting on her. Just looking at that chubby little person, his heart melted. So did Qin Mu. She looked at Xiao Yishu with sweat on her forehead and couldn't help but laugh. Brother, I think Lan Yu must love her a lot. She looks like Cher when she was young. Yi Muyun looked at his sister quietly, but in his heart he was thinking that if Yishu was like Cher, Lan Yu would love her too. Just thinking about the man who loved her and lived with her for the past 5 years. He didn't care. He wasn't that generous. Yi Muyun let out a long sigh and looked at her son. She reached out and pulled her over. She wiped her sweat and patted her, telling her to continue playing. Straightening himself up, he looked at her and said in a low voice, "You and Zhou Chongguang look pretty good. Have you made up?" There was a difference between not divorcing and reconciling. Obviously, Qin Mu and Zhou Chongguang were on the track of a normal marriage. Or more accurately, they were finally in love. Qin Mu grunted. Then she held onto Yi Muyun's arm and said in a low voice, "Brother, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I want to give it a try." She hadn't been brave for a long time. The last time was when she liked Zhou Chongguang when she was young. Qin Mu thought that her feelings for him had exhausted everything she had. If one day she and Zhou Chongguang didn't end up together, she would probably lose the ability to love. Yi Muyun patted her shoulder and smiled faintly. He was a man and men understood men the best. In Zhou Chongguang's eyes he saw the passion he had for Qin Mu. Chapter 2351. Qin Mu looked up at him and said in a low voice, "What about you and Cher? Are you just going to hang there?" As siblings, if her brother couldn't help it, Cher would think that her brother was a pervert. Qin Mu couldn't help laughing at the thought of that scene. Yi Muyun looked at his sister and said angrily, "What are you laughing at?" Qin Mu was still laughing. "Brother, you must be suffering from holding it in now, right?" In the 8 years when Cher came back, her brother must have vented his anger for a while. But recently he must have had a hard time holding it in. Yi Muyun glared at her. Qin Mu. Qin Mu smiled happily. "Brother, you used to have a way with Cher." She looked at him. "Don't waste your good looks." Actually, she could tell that Cher had feelings for her brother. But with the memory of Lan Yu here, she probably wouldn't take that step easily. Qin Mu smiled gently. Her brother was a little annoyed and pulled her over to punish her. He pinched her little face and deliberately made her feel pain. It was very intimate. And this scene happened to be seen by Cher and Zhou Chongguang, who were standing at the door. Cher frowned slightly and bit her lip for a long time without saying anything. Zhou Chongguang looked at her sideways and said in a low voice, "This is Yi Muyun's sister. Did you see it? His feelings for you are different from his feelings for Qin Mu." Cher's eyes were a little confused and she turned to look at Zhou Chongguang. Zhou Chongguang put his hands in his pockets and said indifferently, "I used to like you." Shui'er tilted her head to look at him in shock. His voice was very calm. "Now I like Qin Mu." Obviously, he felt Cher let out a sigh of relief, so he smiled and said, "Is it bothering you?" Cher's gaze shifted to Yi Muyun. After a while she said indifferently, "No, didn't you say it was in the past?" She didn't know why Zhou Chongguang told her all this. She didn't remember those things in the past. He didn't have to say it so that they wouldn't feel uncomfortable when they met. Besides, there was also Qin Mu in the middle. Zhou Chongguang followed her gaze and looked at Yi Muyun. He then smiled and reminded her, "Then is his liking her troubling you?" Cher retracted her gaze and looked at Zhou Chongguang. Her little face was full of wariness. "Look, you don't remember anything now, but you are full of wariness against others. But you clearly know that he likes you in the past and now, but you still live with him at ease." Tang Cher, you have forgotten him, but your body remembers him. Zhou Chongguang said naturally. It was quite shameful. At least Cher's face turned red. Zhou Chongguang had said these words so many times recently that he didn't feel that he had gone overboard. He continued to say in a low voice, I'm sorry. Cher looked at him in a daze. She didn't understand why he said sorry. The way he and Qinmu looked at her was slightly different. Cher bit her lip and looked up at the warm sun. Her head was dizzy and there was a thin layer of sweat on her back. At this moment Yi Muyun turned his head and his gaze landed on her little face. His face was so handsome that it was almost cold and noble. She didn't dare to look at him directly. Especially when he was looking at her like that, she didn't dare to look at him clearly. Cher's face turned red. Zhou Chongguang's smile deepened. He just smiled faintly and said nothing. Chapter 2352. Yi Muyun walked over and said in a low voice, Why don't you put on your coat? You'll catch a cold. She felt that her face was burning hot, especially with Zhou Chongguang beside her and what he had said earlier on. She felt uncomfortable and said softly, I'm not cold. The next second he held her little hand and said in a low voice, How dare you say you're not cold? Your hands are cold. Cher's entire attention was on his hand that was holding hers. She lowered her eyes and looked at it nervously. I'll go back first. She wanted to escape, but he held her little hand and did not let go. Cher's little hand struggled for a moment, but she could not break free from his big palm. Her delicate little hand looked especially small in his palm. The contrast between her fair skin and the color of wheat was very strong, as though it was a piece of love jade. She looked at it for a while and looked up at him in a daze. Yi Muyun reached out and rubbed her little face before turning to Qinmu. You accompany Ishu. Then his big palm landed on Cher's shoulder and brought her into the hall naturally. Qinmu turned her head and squatted down to chat with Xiao Ishu. She had never felt so childish before. Zhou Chongguang stood at the side and listened quietly. He looked at her with such a happy expression. He thought that she should like children. He walked over and squatted down beside her. Sometimes he would look at Xiao Ishu and sometimes at Qinmu. His entire body was filled with a faint sense of warmth. This was probably the smell of home. In the hall, Cher bit her lip. All right, why don't you accompany Xiao Ishu? At this moment, there was no one else in the hall except for the two of them. The empty and unfamiliar space made her feel uneasy. She had a feeling that she wanted to escape. This was his home and she was his sister. It seemed normal for her to go home with him, but it was actually not normal. She bit her lip, her mind filled with Zhou Chongguang's words. Yi Muyun smiled. I have something to tell you. As he spoke, he pulled her to sit side by side on the sofa. She sat on the side and he sat next to her. It was equivalent to forcing her into a corner, which made Cher feel a sense of oppression. She bit her lips and let out an tilting her head, her face was filled with helplessness. Yi Muyun's hand was placed horizontally on the back of the sofa. His action seemed very casual, but he was still holding her in his arms. These days the little guy was very guarded against him, he almost didn't even kiss her. After pondering for a while, Yi Muyun said calmly, Qinmu is planning to open an art gallery and wants you to run it with her. Me. Cher slightly widened her eyes, but her mind seemed to have gone through the past. Those were incomparably familiar. They were all personally brought to her by Lan Yu. There was a hint of pain in her eyes. She looked at him hopelessly and her lips moved. Don't think too much. His voice was gentle and his slender and beautiful fingers gently stroked her long hair. If you don't want to, you can stay at home with Ishu, okay? Cher kept looking at him. After looking at him for a long time, she said softly, It's not that I don't want to. Let me think about it. She was thinking that she couldn't always rely on him. He had to move out. And perhaps this was an opportunity. Although running the art gallery together with Qinmu still had something to do with him, it was better than being a leech at home. Chapter 2353. You don't have to thank me if I'm your brother. There was a hint of playfulness in his tone. Besides, I'm just asking you on behalf of Qinmu. She's a little embarrassed to ask you directly. At this time Cher thought of Zhou Chongguang. She frowned and wondered if this was a good idea. As long as you're willing, everything else is fine. Yi Muyun said calmly as if he could read her mind. Cher listened to his voice and fell into a trance again. Then she remembered that he didn't seem to touch her easily recently. Other than rubbing her hair, he wouldn't kiss her casually anymore. Although it was much easier to get along with him, she always felt that it was still dangerous to be with him. But she was glad. At lunchtime, Chin-Moo asked Cher about the art gallery again and Cher agreed. After lunch, the two girls took Xiao Yishu upstairs to talk about the art gallery. Of course, Cher was like a blank piece of paper and everything was handled by Chin-Moo. Cher was only responsible for providing the paintings, and she used some of her connections with Lan Yu in New York to get some paintings to support the appearance of the art gallery, and also to hire some artists. Chin-Moo's position was quite high. She specialized in custom-made paintings for powerful companies or individuals, and the cost was not low. Cher was fascinated and they talked until 6 o'clock in the evening. When they finished talking, they found that Xiao Yishu had fallen asleep. Cher and Chin-Moo looked at each other and smiled. They patted the little girl and asked her to go downstairs for dinner. Yi Liangqiu and Qin Anlin were there, and Chin-Moo and Yi Muyun each brought their other halves home, so they felt a little at ease. Especially Yi Liangqiu, who had an indescribable feeling in her heart. She looked at Xiao Yishu. That was her granddaughter. But she couldn't recognize her. She didn't know what Muyun was thinking. Was he more helpless than she was? Also, Cher had lost her memory and had lost her previous sharpness. Yi Liangqiu felt even more guilty. She felt so sorry for this child, but it seemed so deliberate to treat her well. She could only sigh. Soon after dinner, the two young couples went home. Yi Liangqiu took a shower absent-mindedly. When she returned to the bedroom, Qin Anlin was flipping through a magazine. She lay down and reached out to take the magazine from his hand. She didn't say anything and just lay quietly beside him, resting her face on his shoulder. Qin Anlin's voice was a little soft. Liangqiu, why are you still so sad today? She lowered her eyes and leaned her face against her husband. Anlin, my heart hurts when I see Cher like that. She lost 8 years with Mu Yun and lost her memory. If Lan Yu were to wake up again, would she still be Lan Yu's wife? Qin Anlin patted her shoulder and sighed. She won't. You have to believe in Mu Yun. He seemed to have thought of something and smiled. Think about the past. Mu Yun had Cher under his control. Yi Liangqiu leaned her head on his shoulder. Her expression was a little dazed as she was immersed in her memories. After a long time she said softly, yes, they were so beautiful at that time. As she spoke, she choked with sobs. Anlin, I'm very bad. For Mumu's life, I destroyed such a beautiful relationship. They were really good at that time. Qin Anlin knew that this was a knot in his wife's heart for more than 8 years. It was not that he didn't regret it, but how could he have the heart to blame her? He reached out and patted her shoulder. Now it's already very good. Chapter 2354. The night was like a curtain, and the street lights extended into the distance like a long dragon. Inside the speeding car, Yi Muyun's slender fingers held the steering wheel and his eyes were focused on the front. He took a moment to look at Cher holding Xiao Yishu in the rearview mirror and said lightly, "Is she asleep?" His voice was very gentle in the quiet night. Schweiger hummed in agreement, her voice soft and light. Yi Muyun's lips curved slightly and his eyes fell on her face for a few seconds before he looked away. It was not until 8:30 that the car drove into the villa where they lived. When Cher was about to get out of the car, he stopped her. "Let me carry her. The little fellow is too heavy." Cher replied. When he opened the door and carried Xiao Yishu, she got out of the car and walked quickly. "Cover her with a small blanket or she will catch a cold." He paused and let her cover her. But when she looked up, she happened to meet his deep eyes. When their eyes met, she shivered and pursed her lips. "Go in." She walked forward first, and there was an inaudible chuckle behind her, as if he was laughing at her. Cher stopped in her tracks. She stood in the hall and glared at him. Yi Muyun brushed past her, but when he passed by, he whispered, "Little fool." Snow's hair stood on end. She wasn't an idiot. His whole family was a fool. But she did not dare to say this. She could only stare at him and purse her lips, looking very pitiful. Then she reluctantly followed him upstairs like a little tail. Yi Muyun carried the little fellow to her bedroom. After putting her down, he looked sideways at Cher, who followed him, and whispered, "Help her put on her pajamas." Although Xiao Yishu refused to wear a girl's dress, she was still a girl, so it was better for her mother to do such a private thing. Cher nodded and ran to the changing room to get a set of pajamas. She knelt beside the bed and carefully helped Xiao Yishu change her clothes. Yimuyun quietly looked at her back. Then he continued to look down. His deep eyes seemed to be on fire. However, she didn't notice it at all. She only got out of bed after changing into her pajamas. However, just as she turned around, she was hugged by him. Her little mouth was blocked by his warmth, firmly like a hot plug. Under the dim yellow light, his kiss was a little hot. He carried her to the door and pushed her against it, kissing her. Cher was stunned. Her eyes widened as she stared at him. Her back was pressed against the cold door, and in front of her was his warm body. He cupped her little face and kissed her deeply, invading her nerves bit by bit. Suddenly, her legs went soft and she felt like she couldn't stand. What was he doing? She suddenly struggled and shook her head, trying to break free from him. However, her struggle was met with even more pressure from him. "Baby, be good," he murmured. His voice was dreamy as he kissed the corner of her mouth bit by bit, comforting her. He had no choice but to be passionate. She didn't know why, but he just couldn't control himself tonight. Cher was pressed against him like that. The moment she moved, she felt the hair-raising contact. She didn't dare to struggle anymore. She could only raise her little face and accept his kiss. Such a posture was obviously dangerous because he was on the verge of exploding. Cher was a little scared and felt a little guilty. However, he seduced her. She couldn't help but kiss him again and again, entangled and passionate. His coat fell to the ground and so did his. The layers of his coat were pushed together, looking very intimate. Chapter 2355. She was getting hotter and hotter as he kissed her more and more. Furthermore, they were kissing in Xiao Yishu's room without the lights off. Even the sound of their panting was so shameful. She was trembling uncontrollably, half out of fear and the other half out of excitement. Scared. His hot breath was on her neck as he asked softly. She sobered up a little and said with a trembling voice, "No, you don't like me kissing you?" His thin lips were on the back of her ears. Feeling that she was burning hot, he chuckled. Cher's eyes were filled with warmth as though they were filled with water. She looked at him hopelessly. "I don't like it. Your body is more honest than your mouth." He chuckled and kissed her lips from behind her ear. After kissing her for a long time, he looked up with a deep gaze. "Little liar." Cher shook her head frantically. "I didn't." She was on the verge of tears. Finally, a tear rolled down from the corner of her eye. She then turned her face away and refused to look at him. Yimuyun looked up and asked in a hoarse voice, "Why are you crying?" Had he pushed her too far? Reaching out, he wiped away the tears from the corner of her eyes and coaxed her. "Be good, it's my fault. I shouldn't have treated you like this." He kissed her pink eyelids and said in a gentler voice, "All right, don't cry anymore. I won't kiss you anymore. I'll carry you to rest for a while, Cher bit her lip and looked at him, not saying anything. He smiled and carried her up. Opening the door, he walked out. However, he carried her to his own bedroom. The moment he put her down, she struggled and clamored to get off the bed. "Stay here and don't move. I'm going to the bathroom." He bent his knees and stared at her eyes, trying to scare her. "If you dare to go out, I'll go to your room, She understood instantly. Staring at his eyes, her lips trembled as she spat out, "You're a bad person." He smiled and reached out to pinch her little face. Then he straightened his body and walked to the bathroom. Cher stared at his back view as she bit her lips and curled up her body. Leaning against the headboard, she stared at the direction of the bathroom. She really didn't dare to leave because just now, she clearly felt that he was very excited. Is he going to the bathroom to solve it himself? Soon, the sound of running water could be heard in the bathroom. She suddenly felt her mouth go dry. She couldn't help but imagine what he was doing right now. She covered her face and scolded herself silently. How could she have a relationship with him? Cher pursed her lips and stared at the bathroom door. He only came out after about 10 minutes. His body was steamy and he was only wearing a bathrobe. She suddenly felt that it was very dangerous for a man who had just taken a bath. Yimuyun took a dry towel and gently wiped his hair. His voice was indifferent. "What are you afraid of?" He walked over slowly and threw the towel that he used to wipe her wet hair on her little head. With the towel on her head, Cher looked a little ridiculous. She reached out and pulled the towel down. Yimuyun looked at her and took a cigarette from the bedside table. He lit it up skillfully. The blue flame illuminated his handsome features, making him look more manly. He took a puff and leaned against the sofa. He smiled. "Don't worry, I've solved it. I won't touch you." Chapter 2356. She looked at him nervously after asking the question. Yimuyun held a cigarette between his long fingers. He smiled at her and then burst out laughing. "No." Cher was a little angry as she glared at him. "You think I'm the bad guy again, huh?" His eyes were gentle. "Cher, in the past, you've always treated me like the world." His voice suddenly sounded a little disappointed. "But now you're the one who's most afraid of me." Her heart ached. She looked at him cautiously. She saw a hint of pain in his eyes. He suddenly felt uneasy. The more she knew about their past, the more guilty she felt. She enjoyed his care, but she wasn't prepared to give anything in return. And he could see it clearly. She didn't know why he was still so nice to her. "Because it's a habit," he said mildly, reading her thoughts. Cher bit her lip. After a long while she said uneasily, "I can't promise you anything. Promises are made by a man to a woman." He smiled, stubbed out the cigarette and walked towards her. Cher clutched the bedsheets nervously. He leaned forward and kissed her little mouth, murmuring, "You'll sleep here tonight." "I'll sleep in the study." Her eyes widened. She didn't understand why he would make such an arrangement. Yimuyun didn't explain. He only smiled and reached out to stroke her hair. "Be good. Listen to me." With that he walked out of the bedroom. Cher stared blankly at the closed door. After a long while she went to take a shower and put on a large bathrobe. She felt a little empty being alone in the bedroom, which was full of masculinity. She lay down and switched off the lights. His scent was all around her, and just lying there like that made her face burn. She finally fell asleep, but in her dream she saw him kissing her. Snow woke up in a state of extreme shame. She covered her face as soon as she woke up, not daring to recall the dream she had just had. It was so real. Every detail and every hair cell was clearly magnified. Even that kind of sharp pain, she could feel it. She couldn't sleep anymore. She covered her face and curled up at the head of the bed. At this moment she actually yearned for his embrace, yearned for the warmth of his body. There was a sudden flash outside the window. In an instant the world was as bright as day and it was glaring. She shrunk back and turned her head to look out the window. Then there was a loud rumble of thunder. Cher screamed and buried her face in her knees. She was still afraid, so she crawled under the blanket. His little body was trembling, his entire body was trembling. Lightning and thunder sounded one after another. Even in the dark bedroom, it was as bright as day. She couldn't stop screaming and trembling in fear. The bedroom door opened and she was pulled into a warm embrace. Her small face was pressed against his warm body. When the thunder sounded, she buried herself in his arms and said in a weak voice, "Hug me." Yimuyun lowered his head helplessly. "You're already so big, yet you're still afraid." She was afraid when she was young. He thought that after so many years she would not be afraid anymore. After all, she was a 26-year-old girl. But at this moment the little girl in his arms was trembling so violently, her little hands hugging him so tightly, as if he was her only support in this world. Chapter 2357. She was like a little puppy snuggling up in his arms and kissing him randomly. She kissed him until his entire body was burning up, but he had to suppress it. Because when she woke up tomorrow she would regret it. His hand pressed down on her mischievous little hand and his voice was hoarse. "Be good, don't move." If she continued kissing him like this, he would not be able to take it. He was a normal man, and the person in his arms was the girl he had loved for so many years. How could he not be flustered? If he did not have any reaction, he would not be a man. But no matter how he tried to stop her, she still hugged him like a little puppy, kissing the corner of his mouth randomly. "Cher." His voice was hoarse and he held her slender little arm, his dark eyes deep. "I can't guarantee what will happen if we continue kissing. Are you sure?" She moved away a little, looking at him with watery eyes. She looked like a weak beast, vulnerable and wanting to look at him. Yes, he could feel that she wanted him. She was so obvious. If he rejected her again, he would not be a man. He reached out and held her in his arms, his thin lips on the side of her neck, and his voice was very low. Even if you want to pull away, I will not let you go. With that said, he turned over, and as she screamed, he kissed her hard on the little mouth, and they were completely entangled. Outside the window, the light still shone through the darkness. In the bedroom, in the flickering light, their bodies were entangled again and again in the eternal melody, and the two lost hearts were slowly approaching each other. After countless struggles, she still could not control her primal urges and walked towards him. At this moment she forgot about Lan Yu, forgot about Ishu, and only knew that she wanted this man. She really, really wanted him. And he, who had been repressed for too long, and the little person in his arms was so passionate, let go and did not let go of her for the whole night. At dawn, the rain that had been falling for the whole night finally stopped. The sky was gray and there was fresh air everywhere mixed with the smell of the earth. A chubby little hand gently pushed open the door of the master bedroom and a little cat walked in. The chubby little guy wrinkled its nose and walked inside again. The light in the bedroom was very dim. When the little guy walked to the bed, he saw two people lying on the bed. Isansen was holding his mother in his arms. The little guy's face fell and he carefully lifted the blanket. Ah! The little fellow let out a shriek. The person on the bed would wake up no matter how deep he slept. Yimuyun and Cher were leaning against the headboard, both wrapped in bedsheets as if they had been caught in the act. Especially Cher, she did not know how to explain. The little man looked as if he was about to faint. He stared at them with tears the size of beans rolling down his cheeks. Yimuyun coughed lightly. Well, your mother is afraid of thunder. So I hugged her to sleep. The little fellow was still glaring at him, her little mouth flattened. In the past, when there was thunder, Mommy would never look for Daddy. Of course, it was because Lan Yu was not your father. At this moment, Yimuyun made up his mind. But before that, he first looked at Cher in his arms and then said slowly, Ishu, you are not Lan Yu's child, you are my son. He paused, frowned, and corrected her, daughter. After he said that, Xiao Ishu was stunned. So was Cher. What was he talking about? He gave birth to Xiao Ishu. Chapter 2358. She was infuriated. He had already given birth to someone else's child. Why did he have to sleep with her last night? Yimuyun could only feel a headache coming on. He rubbed his forehead and looked at her. Do you think that there's someone else besides you, an idiot? No matter how docile a sheep who had lost her memory was, she would still get angry. They had just slept together and he was already calling her an idiot. That was really infuriating. Cher bit her lip. Yimuyun, you bastard. He looked at her and sighed in his heart. Calling her an idiot was already praising her. Didn't she catch the main point of his words? He looked at the little one again. She was also staring at him with tears in her eyes. I'm Daddy's child. Of course. Yimuyun lifted the blanket and walked down. He carried Xiao Ishu and placed her under the blanket. He looked at her and said softly, I'm the daddy. Xiao Ishu was only a few years old after all. She was shocked and her eyes were filled with tears as she looked at him. Cher was the same. She had lost her memory, but she remembered clearly that Xiao Ishu was Lan Yu's son. How did she become her and Yimuyun's daughter? It was too messy. Later on, Yimuyun did a DNA test with Xiao Ishu and Cher too. The result was that Xiao Ishu was their child. The only thing was that Yimuyun still couldn't figure out until now. Ishu was indeed 5 years old. They had been separated for 8 years, so why was she only 5 years old? He vaguely thought that it might have something to do with Cher's illness at that time. But only Lan Yu knew the truth. Boy's office. Yimuyun stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. Guze approached him slowly. Mr. Yi, there's news from the hospital that Lan Yu might wake up. Do you want him to wake up? Yimuyun narrowed his eyes and turned his head to look at Guze with a burning gaze. His voice was deep and slow. How could he have a chance to wake up? Guze paused for a moment before he said, according to the neurology experts, Lan Yu's will to live is very strong. His brain wave data is getting more and more normal every day. I'm afraid he'll wake up soon. As he spoke, his voice deepened. President Gu, do you wish for him to live or to sleep forever? After saying that, Guze's gaze fell on Yimuyun's face. Yimuyun didn't speak immediately. Instead, he turned around and looked at the panoramic view of B City outside the floor-to-ceiling window. Boy was almost completely under his control. Cher and Ishu were also by his side. What else could he not be satisfied with? After a long time he said calmly, Guze, I've lost a lot in the journey to such a high place. That purchase of glory was more than just a personal grudge. At that time he was young and full of vigor. He felt that he could do anything. But now he only wanted an ordinary happiness. This happiness could only be given to him by his wife and daughter. He thought that if he did anything to Lan Yu, Cher probably wouldn't forgive him. He smiled bitterly and turned to look at Guze. If Lan Yu wants to wake up, let him wake up. Guze was a little surprised because this was obviously not Mr. Ye's style. Yi Muyun's expression became even more indifferent. There are too many mysteries about Lan Yu, including Ishu's birth. He needs to solve them. Cher and I can't live together like this forever. He gritted his teeth. I also can't stand her going to the hospital to see a vegetable every day. Guze understood. This last point was the main point. Chapter 2359. After a while Yi Muyun said softly, Take me to the hospital. He paused for a moment before saying, I want to see him. Guze nodded. I'll make the arrangements. Yi Muyun's eyes flickered slightly. When he looked out of the window again he said calmly, Don't let Cher know. Guze was about to say something when his phone rang. He answered the call immediately. After listening for a while he had a complicated expression on his face. After hanging up he played with the phone with his fingers and said with a complicated expression, Lan Yu has woken up. The director called to ask Mr. Yi whether to keep Lan Yu awake or to keep him in a coma. Yi Muyun looked at Guze and said slowly, Keep him awake. Don't let Cher know. He was already walking towards the door. I'll go. Guze nodded. As he walked he dialed the number he had just called and instructed, Don't move around. When they reached downstairs the chauffeur drove the car. Yi Muyun sat in the back seat with his thumb resting on his chin. He was deep in thought. Guze would answer a call from time to time. About half an hour later, the black limousine arrived at Xingyuan Hospital. The director had been looking forward to it for a long time. The director really couldn't make up his mind about this matter. Who was the person staying in the hospital? It was Mr. Ye's rival in love. It was good enough that he didn't kill him. He still had to take good care of him. The director had to admire Lan Yu for his strong willpower. After lying in bed for so long he had woken up. Was he going to fight with Mr. Yi for a woman? The director came up and coughed lightly. Mr. Yi, how do you want to deal with Lan Yu? Yi Muyun paused for a moment and looked at him. Kill him. Cold sweat broke out on the dean's forehead and he smiled a little uncomfortably. How could he say this kind of thing? Mr. Yi ignored him and walked directly to the elevator of the inpatient department. When he saw Lan Yu, even Yi Muyun was shocked. How long had it been since they last met? That man with a melancholic temperament had actually become so thin. He stood in front of Lan Yu's bed, thinking that his little fool would probably cry her eyes out when she saw Lan Yu like this. The more he thought about it, the more irritated he felt like smoking. He walked to the sofa and sat down. He lit a cigarette and said to the people behind him, All of you get out. Guze looked at the dean, but the dean's thoughts were all on whether to let Lan Yu live, so he refused to leave. Guze's voice deepened. Do you still want to be the dean? These words were a little harsh. The dean felt a little wronged. He just wanted to work for Mr. Yi. But since Vice President Gu had said so, he didn't dare to stay. After the door closed, Yi Muyun looked at Lan Yu and said in a low voice, I should say congratulations. Lan Yu had just woken up. His body was still very weak. His gaze fell on Guze's face. After a while he said in a hoarse voice, You are very disappointed? No. Yi Muyun's voice was very calm. I just happened to have something to ask you. Lan Yu tilted his head. His thin face had a touch of pain. At this moment his whole body was in pain. Then he closed his eyes slightly. Shin-in coughed and a broken sound came from his throat. And Yi Muyun was still waiting quietly, very patiently. Lan Yu finally spoke, Can you give me some water? Chapter 2360. After a long time Lan Yu said in a low voice, Will you kill me after asking me? Yi Muyun didn't answer immediately. Instead he got up and poured a glass of water for Lan Yu in a cold and noble manner. He placed it beside his bed and said in a calm voice, Sit up if you want to drink. Lan Yu's lips were very dry and the skin was peeling. In the days that he was unconscious, he relied on drips to sustain his life. However, these were only enough to sustain him. His human instincts made him yearn for a sip of water. Hence he struggled with all his might to sit up and support himself. Yimuyun just looked at him coldly and didn't help him. After 5 minutes, Lan Yu finally struggled to sit up and panted violently. He also roughly understood why he was able to wake up. This seemingly gentle man had a willpower that was no weaker than his own. Lan Yu graduated from Stanford University's economics department, but changed to oil painting for an unknown reason, Yimuyun said in a calm voice as he looked at Lan Yu with a burning gaze. Lan Yu's slightly withered fingers were holding the glass, carefully sipping it. When he heard Yimuyun's words, his fingers trembled. Then he looked up at him in shock. He looked extremely down and out, but Yimuyun didn't dare to underestimate him. He narrowed his eyes and said in a calm voice, "Lan Yu, is that reason Lan Ting?" Lan Yu's hand that was holding the glass began to tremble, and the water in the glass kept spilling out. He looked at Yimuyun, his dry lips trembling. After a long time he said hoarsely, "How did you know? You didn't leave anything behind, but your secretary, your woman, left behind a diary." Yimuyun said in a calm voice, "Does she not mean anything to you? He was the one who killed his secretary first." Lan Ting was provoked to do such an irrational thing. In the end, it was Lan Yu's love for Cher that led to today's situation. Otherwise he wouldn't have found out so quickly. Yimuyun's expression was very calm. "Lan Yu, Lan Ting is dead." Lan Yu's gaze froze. He looked at the cup of water he had been longing for. There was only half a cup left. He looked at it for a long time before he raised his head and carefully took a sip with trembling hands. It was as if the water in the cup was the most precious thing in the world. Perhaps after today Lan Yu would never have the chance to drink it again. Until he finished half a cup of water, he had some strength and his mind was much clearer, but he could only speak, and it was not enough to contend with the cold and noble man in front of him. Lan Yu raised his eyes and looked at Yimuyun. His voice was calm but tense. "Now she's yours again, right?" There was a hint of mockery in his tone. Yimuyun smiled faintly and looked at Lan Yu. "What do you think?" Lan Yu remained silent and closed his eyes. Yimuyun said softly, "I've done a DNA test with Ishu. Lan Yu, I'm very curious. Ishu is 5 years old. Why is she my child?" Lan Yu's gaze was a little shocked and he kept staring at Yimuyun. Yimuyun pursed his thin lips. "Do you know why I didn't kill you at this moment?" Lan Yu's body fell behind him and he squinted at the man in front of him. He didn't say a word. Yimuyun continued in a low voice, "Because you like her." Chapter 2361. Yimuyun looked at him indifferently. "I guessed it. Because between Lan Ting and Cher, you chose to let Cher live." Yimuyun smiled. "Lan Yu, you persevered for so many years and played such a big game of chess. In the end it was ruined by your own inner demons." Lan Yu's face was ashen. Yimuyun's voice continued to sound indifferent. "You fell in love with her so you gave up." The cup in Lan Yu's hand fell to the ground and broke into pieces. Yimuyun opened the door of the ward and walked out. He said indifferently, "Lan Yu, take care." Lan Yu was a person who lived in the dark. He was destined to be a tragedy. When his hand was on the doorknob, Lan Yu's trembling voice sounded desolate and humble. "Will you let her see me?" And Ishu. To Lan Yu she was his child. Yimuyun lowered his eyes. After a long time he said in a low voice, "Yes. Because you are a part of her life." And he had to learn to respect her slowly. She was no longer a little girl who was not even 18 years old. She was a woman with thoughts. At this moment Yimuyun felt that letting go wasn't that difficult of a task. If he wanted to get it, he had to let go, because he firmly believed that he was the only one in her heart. Whether a woman loved a man or not, her body was the most honest. And after he said that, Lan Yu's face was ashen. If it was said that Yimuyun might have been bluffing before, then now he was sure that he had really lost Shuer. She would never be his again. The door closed. In the deserted ward, Lan Yu's smile was pale and bitter. He couldn't help but think, after so many years, so many opportunities, if only he had loved her earlier, would the ending be different? So, love or not, it all depends on the will of the heavens. Yimuyun walked out. Guzei and the dean were standing outside. He paused for a moment, his gaze quietly falling on the president's face. He slowly said, "Treat Mr. Lon well." The dean was stunned for a moment. Did Mr. Yi change his character? Why did he suddenly become so generous? However, no one dared to disobey Mr. Ye's words. The director agreed, "We will use the best medicine to treat Mr. Lon." Yi Muyun glanced at him and said, "Contact the Lon family and tell them about the situation." The dean was about to burst into tears. He was too touched. Mr. Yi was like an angel now. He was too kind, wasn't he? Yi Muyun didn't have time to watch the director's antics and quickly walked into the elevator. Guze looked at the director and smiled, then followed him out. In the elevator, Yi Muyun's voice was a little tired. "Guze, I don't know if this is the right thing to do. Is Mr. Yi not confident? It doesn't seem like it." Guze smiled faintly. "Or do you think that Lon Yu will do something after the tiger returns to the mountain?" "I'm not afraid of that." Yi Muyun looked at himself in the mirror and said slowly, "The main thing is, do you think Cher will feel sorry for Lon Yu when she sees him like this?" When he thought of his woman watching another man cry, he felt a burst of anger in his heart. Guze smiled and just hung up the phone. The dean called again. He held the phone and looked at Yi Muyun. "This dean is getting more and more incompetent. He keeps calling me for such a small matter." Chapter 2362. Before Guze picked up the call, he laughed. "You're really incompetent if you can't even figure out what he's trying to say." Yi Muyun did not say anything. He just looked at him and picked up the call. Guze only nodded a few times. It was all the talking on the other side. After hanging up the phone, he sighed. The hospital just contacted Lon Yu's parents. His parents are trying their best to get him transferred to another hospital. He paused for a while and said with a smile, "They're probably afraid that you've murdered their son." Yi Muyun pursed his thin lips. "Let them be." Guze continued. But Lon Yu refused. He insisted on staying at Xingyuan Hospital. As for the reason, there was no need to say it. Everyone knew it. Yi Muyun looked at Guze and smiled faintly without saying anything. He closed his eyes for a long time before saying in a low voice, "Let's go back to the villa." Guze smiled. He knew that Yi Muyun was not in the mood to work, so he asked the chauffeur to turn the car around and send Mr. Yi home first. An hour later, the car stopped at the entrance of the villa. Yi Muyun did not get out of the car immediately. He closed his eyes and thought for a while. The chauffeur was already waiting outside the car. Since Yi Muyun did not move, the chauffeur did not dare to disturb him. He just waited quietly. After a while, Yi Muyun pursed his lips and got out of the car. Guze got out of the car and called out to him. Yi Muyun turned his body sideways and looked at him. Guze put one hand on the roof of the car and smiled faintly. "When have you ever been so uncertain?" Yi Muyun paused for a while and smiled faintly. "Probably because I don't believe that I'm so kind." Guze's smile deepened as he watched Yi Muyun walk into the villa slowly. Yi Muyun walked in slowly. The servants at home looked at him in surprise. "Sir, where are Miss and Little Miss?" Yi Muyun took off his coat and threw it on the sofa. He sat down and asked in a hoarse voice, "Where are Miss and Little Miss?" The servant gently tidied up his coat and hung it up before saying softly, "He's sunbathing in the sunroom on the roof." Yi Muyun thought to herself. This was in line with her image of an idiot. She sat down for a while, then got up and walked upstairs. As she walked, she ordered, "Send a pot of scented tea and some snacks up." The servant instinctively replied, "Little Miss has already eaten." Yi Muyun continued walking upstairs without turning back. He raised his hand to unbutton the top 2 buttons of his shirt and said in a low voice, "Then I'll give you another one." The servant was a little puzzled. It should be known that Sir was usually very strict with the Little Miss. Generally, he would not allow her to eat too many sweets. But what was wrong with him today? It was not Sir's style to indulge her like this. However, the servants did not care about the rebellious Yi Muyun and immediately went to the small kitchen to prepare. Yi Muyun walked up the stairs by himself. On the wall beside the top floor there was a mirror. He paused there for a moment and looked at his own face. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. Guze was right. When did he not have confidence, especially in his little idiot? At most there was one more idiot now. The best way to treat the little idiot was to praise her for being smart. Yi Muyun walked up to the sunroom on the top floor. In a sea of red and green he saw two little guys lying on a small blanket in the middle. One was thin and white and the other was fat. In this early winter weather they were actually wearing swimsuits. Chapter 2363. The little girl only had a pair of swimming trunks on her chubby body. It was fine now, but when she grew up, would she go swimming and bask in the sun like this too? Moreover, the two little fellows had fallen asleep. Yimuyun walked over and half knelt beside Shui. He stretched out his hand and picked up one of her ears. His voice was low and hoarse. "It's such a cold day. Why are you dressed like this?" Shui woke up with a start. The first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was his handsome face. His entire body was leaning towards her as if he was going to kiss her. She hurriedly used her small hands to stop his handsome face and said in a low voice, "Little Ishu is still here." His voice was hoarse and he chuckled. "You make it sound like I'm a stepfather." His warm palm was placed on her little belly, and his heart was a little stirred. Ishu was their child, but it wasn't born from her little body. As for how it was born, he thought that it must have been a surrogate pregnancy. However, Lan Yu had spent a lot of energy and money to save Xiao Ishu's life. Although there was some element of conspiracy, he still had to thank that man. Yimuyun's voice was a little hoarse. "What if the servants come up and see you lying here dressed like this?" She placed her little hand on his shoulder, afraid that he would act rashly. Her little face was also red, and she pursed her lips and said in a low voice, "The male employees in the family won't come up like you, and they won't be as lecherous as you even if they come up." His eyes were full of smiles. At 28 years old, there were already fine lines at the corner of his eyes when he was at his most charming, but it also made him look a little more seductive and mature. "It seems that if I don't do something, I won't be able to prove what you think of me." His thin lips were next to her ear and he said in a low voice, deliberately teasing her. Cher's fair hand landed on his shoulder. Hearing his words, she suddenly tightened her grip, and her nails scratched the expensive material of his clothes, leaving scratches on it. Then she hugged his neck tightly and said shamelessly, "It's daytime now." "What's wrong with daytime, baby?" He hugged her and his burning hot face found her little mouth and kissed her for a long time. She didn't dare to move and could only let him kiss her. She was pitiful and she was only wearing a thin swimsuit. She was a little scared of the heat of his body when they were stuck together. Ever since they had sex that night, she had avoided him and they had never of sex of each other again. Now was he trying to take back the interest? Cher bit her lip and looked at him helplessly. She regretted wearing this. His gaze was as if he was going to tear the swimsuit of her of it. She was so scared that she put her face on his neck and whispered, "Ishu is still here. Don't do anything stupid." Yimuyun narrowed her eyes and stared at her. She chuckled. "How do you know I'm going to mess around, huh?" Yimuyun narrowed his eyes and stared at her eyes. He chuckled and said, "How do you know I'm going to do it, huh?" She bit her lip, looked at the bright sunshine above, and then looked at Piggy Hunter who was asleep at the side. She was angry. "Yimuyun, you're shameless." Yimuyun chuckled and kissed her little mouth. He said vaguely, "You just realized?" Chapter 2364. As they kissed, his tone changed. His breath was getting hotter and hotter, almost burning her. Cher could feel his eagerness as well. She wrapped her arms around his neck and said softly, "Let's go back to the room, all right? I'm worried about Ishu being here." He murmured beside her lips in a low voice. She was furious as she punched him. "Yimuyun, you bastard. Was he going to do something so shameful in front of Xiao Ishu?" She glared at him. However, she was just bluffing. Yimuyun looked at that plump little fellow before continuing to kiss the little person in his arms. His voice was extremely hoarse. "Ishu, I think there's a need to educate her and correct her misconceptions." Cher almost exploded as she glared at him. "You're shameless. I only want you." His thin lips kissed her delicate neck and he smiled. Then he began to torture her. Cher was drenched in sweat as she bit her lips and hugged him. He got what he wanted. The servant who was delivering snacks downstairs had just pushed open the door to the top floor when he heard the sound of sobbing. The servant was experienced and understood it after thinking about it. Blushing, he left. It was really rash. Little Miss was still here and he couldn't wait any more. The door closed once more. In the warm sunroom, Cher was covered in sweat as she snuggled in his arms, crying softly. However, the louder she cried, the more he found it interesting. Hence he tortured her even more. In the end, she had no choice but to hug his neck and call him brother. She praised him and begged for mercy. At this moment she would say whatever he wanted to hear. She couldn't care less about her shame anymore. She had thought that he would let her off just like that. However, she had clearly underestimated a man's deep-rooted bad habits. Although Yi Muyun enjoyed it, he did not let her off. He used all sorts of methods to torture her until she wished she was dead. When everything calmed down, he laid down as well. Taking off his shirt, he wrapped it around her body and basked in the sun together. Cher turned her face away in annoyance and bit him on the shoulder. "You're a bad man." Yi Muyun chuckled and looked at her with his clear eyes. He couldn't help but lean over to kiss her little mouth. His voice was unbelievably hoarse. "I'm not bad. Does it make you feel good?" Cher couldn't hear his words. She covered her ears and curled up in his arms. She whispered, "Shameless." He laughed, realizing that she had nothing to say other than shameless and bastard. What a child. He smiled happily but then seemed to remember something and his smile disappeared. His little girl was still in his arms. She said in a low voice, "Big brother, can I still see Lan Yu every day?" She was uneasy for fear that he would be angry. Her past with him was a blank, but she liked him again. She didn't want to change because this was the feeling of liking someone. Although she couldn't remember it clearly, she remembered that when she was with Lan Yu, she didn't really want to sleep with him. And when she saw Yi Muyun, it seemed like she wanted to be with him every day. She wanted to sleep with him. Just like just now. Just thinking about it made Cher feel a little ashamed. She bit her lip and looked at him with tears in her eyes. How could he not know that her mind was as transparent as a little girl? Hence he teased her in a low voice. "Be good. Do you like it?" Chapter 2365. She looked at him and stuttered a little, unable to speak for a long time. The expression on her face was like that of a weak animal. He kept looking at her and sighed. "How should I make you feel better, huh?" Snow suddenly wrapped her arms around his waist, her voice sounding a little silly and adorable. "Big brother, don't worry. I feel terrible." He nodded and looked down at her with a gentle expression. His big palm patted her shoulder and the corner of his mouth slightly curved up. How could it be? "It's true." She rested her little face on his shoulder and said in a low voice, "Lan Yu is still in a vegetative state. I feel blissful but uneasy." He looked at her quietly for a while and suddenly said, "Lan Yu has woken up." "What?" Snow sat up in his arms, a look of shock on her face. Yi Muyun's eyes were calm. "Is he has woken up?" She remembered, but she was worried about him, so her eyes became watery and she looked pitiful. He just sat there, his white shirt hanging loosely on him. His black hair fell over his shoulders and he looked indescribably weak and beautiful. He knew what she was thinking, but he deliberately ignored her. He looked at her and smiled faintly. "What's wrong?" Schweyer bit her lip and gently shook his arm. "Big brother, I want to see him." "You just slept with me and you want to see another man, huh?" He acted like a superior. Cher pursed her lips slightly. She didn't know what to say and her eyes became even more watery. She didn't want him to see it, so she looked down and lowered her head. Seeing her like this, Yi Muyun didn't know whether to be angry or amused, but her heart was soft, indescribably soft. He reached out and stroked her long hair. "Do you want to see him?" he asked in a low voice. She nodded and looked up at him, shaking his arm like a little girl. "Big brother, I beg you." Yi Muyun slightly narrowed his eyes. Then he covered her ears with his thin lips and lectured, "Baby, beg me to give it a try." Beg. Her eyes were filled with tears as she stared at him. She didn't understand why he said that. Was begging him enough? The adorably silly little girl pursed her lips and knelt beside him, begging him in a low voice. Yi Muyun raised his eyebrows and propped himself up. He stared at her little face with a burning gaze and chuckled, "Is this how you beg people, huh?" His fingers gently caressed her red lips, hinting at her. Although Cher didn't understand, she looked at him as if she would eat him alive. Eating humans, she could vaguely feel something bursting out of the ground. Then it was like a rewind. 10-year-old Yi Muyun, 7-year-old Yi Muyun, the way they looked at her was like a milk bun, as if they wanted to eat her up. Be careful, don't get eaten. It was as if there was a string in her mind that was suddenly pulled. Then everything became clear. Cher's expression was a little dazed. She kept looking at him, her gaze a little dazed. In the blink of an eye, she recalled everything, including the parting and the pain she had suffered. She looked at the enlarged, handsome face in front of her. He was bullying her. She was used to being bullied since she was young. If she didn't guess wrong, he was thinking of some shameless activity right now. Chapter 2366. Cher's gaze was still in a daze. Yi Muyun's fingers moved downwards and pinched her little chin, teasing her softly, "Little cutie, little sweetheart." Cher turned her face away, feeling a little reluctant. He was such a pervert. Since when did he have such a weird sense of humor? Her gaze was blank, not letting him know that she had regained her memory. She still had that silly and adorable look on her face. The man who was possessed by the jade bug raised an eyebrow and hooked her in his arms. His thin lips pressed against her little ear as he lectured her naughtily, his voice hoarse and hoarse. "You shouldn't beg a man to do something like this." Cher looked up at him, her eyes teary. "I didn't beg you to do anything." "You didn't beg me?" His voice became hotter. "You want to see another man? Isn't that called begging me to do something?" She was about to cry in his arms. Her voice was soft and weak. "Then I beg you." His gaze was clear and deep, with the expression of an adult man who was about to do something bad. He could tell. Moreover, she had already recalled everything. "Think carefully about how you should beg me, HM." He nibbled on her little ear gently. Cher's eyes were a little misty as she blinked and looked at him. After a while, she bit her lip and said in a low voice, "So how about this?" She hugged him and kissed his chin gently, slowly moving downwards. His voice was extremely hoarse. "Cher, a little further down. Like this? Brother, still like this?" She asked in a very silly and adorable manner, but her actions were not silly and adorable at all. It almost drove him crazy. Yi Muyun gritted his teeth. "It's already very good, be good." She was like a little animal, burying her little face and doing all kinds of shameful things to him, but she still looked very, very scared. It was simply killing him. In the end, she cried and said that she didn't know how to do it and called him brother. He tried to teach her a few times, but she didn't know how to do it. She only knew how to lie on her stomach, trembling like a helpless little animal. Left with no other choice, he hugged her and slowly pressed her into his embrace. Gently biting her little lips, he whispered hotly, "So stupid, what should I do?" The little fellow in his arms did not say anything. She only buried herself in his arms and endured his cruel whips. He didn't let her go until night fell. He reached out and brought the sleeping Xiao Ishu back to the master bedroom. Under the warm yellow light, the family of three lay down together. It was very cozy. Yi Muyun tilted his head and looked at the little pig lying on the side. He couldn't help but laugh. "You can really sleep. Just like when you were a kid." That piglet was still panting softly and his whole body was still in the aftertaste. After a long while, she finally calmed down and looked at him sideways. Her voice was also soft. "When can I visit Lanyu?" Yi Muyun's fingers gently rubbed her little face and smiled. "The Blue family is now in the hospital. Are you sure you want to see it?" Cher glared at him. She had been fooled. He had clearly done it on purpose. Obviously, she and Lanyu were fake husband and wife, and Lanyu had become like this because of her. And Lan Ting. Yes, Lan Ting was dead. Xiao Ishu was not even a child of the Blue family. With all these added up, how could she have the face to go to the hospital? Cher felt that she had fallen into his trap, so she turned her little face to ignore him. Chapter 2367. She still refused to talk to him and continued to turn away from him. Immune chuckled. She was still so cute even when she was angry. He hugged her tightly and coaxed her in a husky voice. "Then, why don't you beg me again, Cher turned around abruptly and glared at him. He still had the cheek to say that he begged her. She had used her hands and mouth just now, but he had played a trick on her. Jerk. She wasn't good at scolding people, so she could only squeeze out those two words. Then she lifted the blanket angrily and got off the bed, walking towards the door. Yi Muyun chuckled softly and quietly got off the bed and entered her bedroom. She slammed the bathroom door shut. I want to take a shower. Get out. He couldn't help but laugh. She had quite a big temper. But he still walked over quietly and opened the bathroom door. Cher was taking a shower and the bathroom was filled with mist, making her body look hazy and beautiful. She looked at him sideways, looking a little dazed. Then she threw a bar of soap at him. Go away. Her voice was coquettish and soft. Rather than saying that she was angry, it would be more accurate to say that she was acting coquettishly. Yimuyun chuckled softly and quickly hugged her from behind, kissing her delicate face and neck. Beg a few more times and I might agree, No, she said angrily and weakly. But how could she resist his seduction? Omitting 10,000 words. When he was completely satisfied, he carried her out of the bathroom. Cher nestled in his arms and said in a low and husky voice, I must see him today. He patted her butt and glanced at her. Just because of that, I want to do it a few more times. So she had accompanied him to do it just to see Lanyu? What kind of logic was that? Cher whimpered as he carried her horizontally in his arms. She kicked and bit him fiercely like a wild animal. He violently hit her a few times until she was in pain and became obedient. Shuya was crying and throwing a tantrum in his arms. He couldn't bring himself to harden his heart any longer. After lying down with her, he kissed her. I'll arrange for you to meet him tomorrow afternoon, okay? She looked at him eagerly, her eyes clear and bright with a hint of suspicion. I'm not trustworthy, huh? He reached out and pinched her little nose. Shuya looked at him, at his handsome face. Her expression was even colder than before. Her gaze was distant, as if she had not seen him for a long time. Suddenly she reached out and hugged him, burying her face in his waist, and softly called out, Gidge. At this moment she was very afraid that she had almost lost him. She didn't dare to think that if she was killed by Lan Ting, would she never see her brother again? She was thinking of no one but him. Because he was her only regret in this world. She closed her eyes for a long time, absorbing the warmth of his body. She said in her heart that she missed him, that she loved him, but she did not want to tell him that she remembered. Perhaps it was a prank. Seeing her act coquettishly, his heart instantly softened, and he reached out to touch her little head. Under the warm yellow light, it was a scene of tenderness, quiet and beautiful. After a while she raised her little head, her little face very red. Gidge, he replied with his gaze focused on her. His face was really handsome. Cher bit her lip and leaned close to his ear. Should I beg you again? Yimuyun looked at his little girl, almost laughing out loud. He suppressed his voice and said, Baby, are you begging me? Chapter 2368. Cher's face was as red as a tomato, but she still looked at him determinedly. So did he. His gaze was so deep that it seemed as though there were flames dancing in the depths of his eyes. She suddenly felt that her lips were a little dry. She licked her lips, but she didn't know how tempting this action was. Yimuyun reached out and pulled her into his arms. His voice was low and husky. I don't need you to beg. You don't need to beg when you're like this. His handsome face was getting closer and closer. Finally he slowly kissed her. Once again the water and dew blended together. Soul and body became one. When it was over, Cher was so tired that she fell asleep. As for him, he was extremely satisfied. Just as he was about to get up, he saw a little person standing at the door. The little person was still only wearing a small swimming trunks. Although it was a little unsightly for a little girl, she was still very cute. At least that was what Yimuyun thought. He stared at the little fellow's naked body and waved at her. Come here. The little piggy stared into his eyes and snorted. Yi Sanson, you're bullying mommy again. Yimuyun sneered. Do you know how you were born? The little piggy climbed into his arms and stuffed its little feet and hands into his arms to keep warm. Even Mr. Yi, who was in his prime, shrank back a little. Then the little fellow said with a smile, Yi Sanson, do you know? Yimuyun pulled the little fellow out of his arms, but the little piggy refused to let go. It was like a magnet, firmly clinging to Yi Sanson's body. I'll count to 3. Tell me where you came from. Yimuyun's voice was a little weak. 1. The little piggy whimpered, but it still clung to him. It was even stronger than a magnet. 2. Yimuyun counted mercilessly. The little fellow's eyes were filled with tears. She hugged him a little tighter. Thin little feet, fat legs, and a little naked body. That scene was indescribable. And that little fellow's eyes were wide open. It was as if she couldn't bear to let him go. Can't bear to part with me? If he really couldn't bear to do it, then he wasn't her father. Yi Muyun stared at the little person, his face darkening. 1. After counting, he plucked the little person from his bosom and carried it with one hand towards the door. The little girl was screaming in the cold. Her little hands and feet tried to climb up into his arms, but Yi Sanson hardened his heart and lifted her outside. Little Lon Air cried out pitifully, "Uncle bullied me. Are you still calling me uncle?" Yi Muyun stared at Cher's tear-stained face. It was as if he could see Cher when she was still a little girl. His heart softened and he reached out to take the little fellow into his arms, allowing her to put her little hands and feet in his arms for warmth. However, he still carried Lon Air to her room and went straight into the bathroom. Little friend Lon Air looked at him warily and covered his little mouth. "You're not allowed to peek," she said it sternly. Yi Muyun looked at her. "You're only wearing a pair of swimming trunks. You're asking me not to peek?" He was now seriously doubting how Lon Yu and Tang Shuiga had managed to bring up Lon Yishu, who was in his second year of high school. Chapter 2369. With a chuckle, Yi Muyun filled the tub with water and gave the little fellow a comfortable bath. Then he put on his towel pajamas. It was a blue elephant pajamas and looked very cute. He carried her in his arms and went downstairs to have dinner with the little fellow. Lon Air looked upstairs and coughed softly. He asked softly, "Where's Mommy?" Yi Muyun smiled slightly. "Mommy is a little tired. She needs to rest." Lon Air looked at him with tears in her eyes. She was supposed to have the backbone not to eat, but she had not eaten since the afternoon. She had already starved to death. She looked at him helplessly and finally picked up a spoon to eat without any backbone. She looked at the bad uncle as she ate. Yi Muyun sat beside the little fellow and reached out to rub her hair. He said in a low voice, "Now do you know where you came from?" "Uncle Ye's stomach." The little fellow admitted reluctantly and shamefully with tears in her eyes. Yi Muyun's face froze. Then he also reluctantly admitted that Lon Air did not inherit much of his perfect genes. She was almost a replica of Cher. But he did not expect that Lon Air would be so handsome when he grew up. Yi Muyun sighed and reached out to touch the little fellow's short hair. He said in a very low voice, "Ishu, you are the child of your mother and I. You only need to remember this, understand?" Xiao Ishu did not make a sound. It was obvious that she was still unwilling. Yi Muyun could not do anything about her for the time being. He smiled and thought about the long days ahead. After accompanying the little fellow for the whole night, it was past 10 o'clock. Cher went downstairs to look for food. She was probably really hungry. Yi Muyun sat on the sofa and did not move. He calmly ordered the servants at home to make a new set for her. Cher was eating in the dining room while Yi Muyun sat on the sofa and watched. Beside him was Xiao Ishu, who was lying on his lap with a comic book in her hand. The little fellow was probably so tired that he had fallen asleep. His small body was lying on top of Yi Muyun's body. His chubby little hands were also clinging to his waist. He seemed to be sleeping very soundly. Cher's eyes felt a little warm as she watched. Although Ishu was his child, she knew that he spoiled Ishu very much. She ate quietly, stealing glances at him from time to time. There was a tinge of gentleness on his handsome face. He did not speak and merely lowered his eyes to look at the little fellow. Cher suddenly felt that he was already very much like a father and he quickly got into this role. She, on the other hand, didn't seem to be able to come in quickly. She was silent, burying her head in her meal. After dinner, Yi Muyun called out to her, "Come and help me get the book." She looked up and replied, "Oh." Yi Muyun reached out and took the comic book from the little fellow's hand, handing it over to Cher. He then carried Xiao Ishu carefully and headed upstairs. He carried her carefully. There was no way he could hide the gentleness in his eyes. Under the light he looked deeply charming. She followed behind him. When they reached the middle, he seemed to be waiting for her on purpose. Cher paused, then looked at him and said slowly, "You seem to dote on her a lot." Yi Muyun chuckled softly and looked at her. "You're jealous of a child, huh?" Chapter 2370. Yimuyun smiled faintly as he carried the little girl to the bedroom and tucked her in. He straightened up and looked at her quietly for a long time, looking as if he was doting on her as much as he could. Cher looked at him looking a little pitiful. Finally he looked sideways and gave her a look of pity. His slender fingers held her fingertips. "Let's go back to the bedroom." She retracted her little hand and stuttered, "I'm only full now." Yimuyun laughed. "What did you think I was going to do, huh?" She lowered her little face. After a moment he smiled and pulled her into his arms. He carried her out of the room and said in a low voice, "Although I really want to do it, you might not be able to handle it." She blushed furiously and struggled. "You're the one who can't handle it." She wanted to bite off her tongue as soon as she said it. His words left too much room for imagination. Yimuyun's gaze had always been clear and bright. She looked at her just like that and said slowly, "Maybe we can use other methods." Cher glared at him. Shameless. He smiled, opened the door and took her back to his bedroom. Then he pressed her against the door and kissed her. He kissed her gently and carefully without the urgency of a lover. Instead there was a faint warmth as if they had been husband and wife for a long time. Cher's body was supported by him against the door, and she felt helpless and addicted to his kisses. Occasionally he would stop and murmur, "Can't handle it, huh?" His voice was really hoarse and she couldn't take it anymore. She shook her head desperately and looked at him as if her eyes were filled with water. Yimuyun chuckled and kissed her delicate little chin as he continued to coax her, "Jealous of a child? Can I give what I gave to you to someone else?" With that said, he shamelessly gave her something different. He wasn't really doing it. He was just teasing her and watching her break down. Cher lowered her head and looked at his black head after he squatted down. She suddenly reached out and grabbed his hair. Her voice was extremely fragile. "No." He stopped laughing and got up to kiss her little mouth. His voice was muffled. "Then tell me, what do you want?" She bit his chin angrily and regretted it immediately. However, he did not get angry. Instead, he smiled faintly and picked her up. "Be good and draw a sketch for me." She looked at him in surprise. Yimuyun smiled, walked to the bedside drawer and took out a few books. When he looked up at her again, his expression was a little indifferent, but it was full of love. He walked towards her and led her to the sofa to sit down. Of course, she was sitting on his lap. She was still not used to such intimacy. It had been too long. She sat on her side, holding the sketchbook that he had given her. She flipped through them one by one and every single one of them was of him. Those lines, those handsome faces, they were both familiar and strange at the same time. It was him of every age. Every age he was handsome and cold. Cher's eyes were downcast with some tenderness. He looked at her with a deep gaze. "Brother, you didn't know how to smile since you were young?" Suddenly she looked up and asked in a soft voice. Yimuyun smiled faintly. "Of course I can. I can only smile when I'm facing you." Cher was stunned. She stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Chapter 2371. After a while he lowered his head and flipped through them again. Then he carefully said, "Look, none of them are funny. You want to see me smile?" His voice suddenly became hoarse. "You can beg me." Cher was about to explode. She glared at him and said, "Can you stop begging me all the time?" It was as if she wasn't satisfied. Strangely, he seemed to be able to read her mind. He chuckled and said, "I'm not satisfied yet. Do you want to do it again?" Cher didn't dare to look up and complained, "Pervert." He smiled and looked at her while she looked at the sketches. After a while he suddenly said, "Actually, you remember, don't you?" She jerked her head up and stared at him, her eyes filled with shock. He didn't avoid her gaze and kept smiling. She said with difficulty, "How did you know?" "Because the way you look at me is different." He smiled and kissed her lips. "Welcome back, Xinshin." He called her by her nickname and Cher's eyes became watery. Her lips trembled but she couldn't say a word. He had been looking at her with tolerance as if they had been together since she was young. She was in his arms and he was within reach. As long as she wanted to, she could have him again. Perhaps she was still angry with him before the car accident. Although she liked him, what happened 8 years ago was still a blow to her. But now she didn't seem to care so much. What she cared about was his existence and whether he was still by her side. Schweyer smiled and wrapped her arms around his neck. Big brother, she called out. Their eyes met, and it was a reunion after a long time. At this moment of warmth, she suddenly asked, Brother, didn't you want me to draw you? Yimuyun looked at her and gritted his teeth. Tang Sher, do you think it's appropriate to do this now? Then what is appropriate? She looked at him. Her appearance was pure and innocent, but there was an endless pair of eyes between her brows. She was like a little demoness in his embrace. He reached out and pinched her little chin. His gaze deepened as he said word by word, make love. She pouted. You said I can't take it. Let's change it in another way. His voice was hoarse. He reached out and took the sketchbook in her hand to the side. Then he picked her up and walked to the bed. He kissed her and rubbed the tip of his nose against hers. Take good care of you, huh? She wrinkled her nose and said unhappily, it's going to hurt. Yimuyun chuckled. Then I'll be gentler. In the end, he didn't let her go for the entire night. When it was over, she lay in his arms and said in a soft voice, You are so unrestrained. His dark eyes were still staring at her as if he hadn't eaten his fill. She lowered her head and bit angrily. He laughed, saying meaningfully, It's because you've starved me for too long. Snow, however, suddenly thought of Song Karen. She harumphed. Then you can do it with your previous girlfriend. Previous girlfriend. Yimuyun chuckled. But I don't want to. Because Song Karen wasn't the person in his heart, he didn't even want to force her. When he said that, she didn't know what to say and just looked at him. Chapter 2372. Yimuyun raised his hand and turned off the light. He said with a sigh, It's time to sleep. Are you avoiding the question because I mentioned Song Karen? She waved her fist and accidentally hit his chin in the dark. He frowned. Do you think I need to avoid the question? There was a smile in his voice again. We're sleeping together again. It doesn't seem wise to care too much about other things, Mrs. Lon, huh? His meaning made her unable to be confident anymore. She only dared to say in a small voice, It's not true that we're married. Yimuyun smiled and didn't say anything else. He just pressed her fluffy little head into his arms. It was late at night. The two hearts that had been lost for a long time finally reunited. Brother, have you ever thought about me in the past 8 years? She suddenly said. Yimuyun lowered his head. He thought she was asleep, but he didn't expect her to still have the energy to talk. His voice was soft and hoarse. Every day, every second I think about you. Then why are you still looking for Song Karen to be your girlfriend? Cher's little teeth bit hard on his chest. He felt a little pain and then he smiled deeply. I have to find a spare tire, don't I, Mrs. Lon? Don't you have one too? Cher was angry. She scratched, bit and hit him. Try calling me Mrs. Lon again. She was so fierce that he restrained her with one hand. Her little body was pressed down and no matter how much she struggled, it was useless. His black eyes were very close to her and his voice was also low. Then call me Mrs. Iha. Cher's face turned red. Fortunately, the light was off and he couldn't see it. Her little face was buried in his arms and she didn't make a sound for a long time. He knew that she was shy. She was already 26 years old, almost 27 years old and a mother of a child, but she was still so easily shy. The more she acted like this, the more he said shameless things in her ears. He couldn't see her face blushing, but he could feel her little heart beating fast, and her little face was frighteningly hot. Only then did he let her go. When he woke up in the morning, it was already a different morning. From now on, she would accompany him every day. Yimuyun tilted his head, looked at his beloved girl and kissed her. She didn't wake up. He probably had too much fun last night. She only frowned when he kissed her. He smiled, lifted the quilt, put on a robe and went to check on Xiao Yishu. That little fellow had not woken up yet. When Mr. Yi returned from the nursery, he leaned against the bedside. His heart was full, but it was also a little lonely. The people he cared about the most were all by his side, but they were all sleeping. He went out to smoke a couple of cigarettes before returning to the bedroom. His little man was still asleep. He smiled and leaned against the side of the bed, reaching out to give her a hug. She had woken up. Lifting her delicate hand, she patted his handsome face lightly. No. He grabbed her little hand and said in a low and husky voice, Don't you want to see Lan Yu? The little fellow in his arms immediately opened her eyes and looked up. Really? Mr. Ye's face instantly darkened. Tang Cher, if you show such a love-struck expression again, I guarantee that you will never see him in this lifetime. Her little mouth opened wide in an instant and she looked at him eagerly. Then, as if she had thought of something, she acted coquettishly in his arms. Brother. Chapter 2373. Xiao Yishu was still young, so there was no need to let her know for the time being. When they got into Yi Muyun's car together, Cher still asked uneasily, "What about the Lan family?" Yi Muyun fastened his seatbelt slowly and looked at her. "Am I not supposed to be seen?" Cher was not confident. "You know." "Know what?" Yi Muyun said impatiently. "You know that Lan Yu raised my daughter as his own and even raised her to be a boy, huh?" Cher lowered her head and put her hand on the car door. She said softly, "Then I won't go." Yi Muyun reached out and held her hand. After a long time he said in a low voice, "Cher, I'm a little jealous, understand?" Her eyes widened as if she couldn't believe it. He raised his eyebrows slightly. "Is it strange that I'm jealous?" She was still looking at him with a surprised expression. Yi Muyun smiled and reached out to rub her hair. "Silly girl." After saying that, he started the car. Christmas was coming and the winter in B City was very cold. Through the front window of the car they could see snowflakes falling from the sky. "It's snowing," the person beside him said softly and then stretched out his hand. "So stupid." Yi Muyun drove very slowly. He looked at the silly girl beside him who was wearing a thick robe and couldn't help but smile. "Is there no snow in New York?" She turned her head and said softly with excitement on her face, "Brother, there's no you in New York." His eyes stayed on her face for a few more seconds and then he focused on driving. Shui'er's heart was boiling. Had she been too unreserved just now? Yi Muyun had been driving the whole time. When she calmed down he suddenly said, "You're getting better at coaxing people now." "I'm not coaxing people." She fell for it and said quickly. Yi Muyun turned his head and looked at her with a smile. He didn't say anything else. When Cher came back to her senses she realized that she had been fooled. But other than blushing there was nothing she could do. The car was still running. She opened the window and tiny snowflakes drifted into the car. Yi Muyun's voice was very calm. "You'll catch a cold. I want to feel it," she said softly, then turned her head and smiled sweetly at him. "Brother, are you happy?" Seeing her like this, his heart softened. How could he not be happy? He was so happy that he sent her to meet his ex-husband. However, the anger in his heart was not worth mentioning in front of her smile, so he held the steering wheel with one hand and grabbed her slender wrist with the other. Cher was stunned for a moment and turned to look at him. His hand slowly moved over to hold her little hand, intertwining their fingers. Her expression changed from astonishment to indescribable gaiety. She looked out of the window again and called him brother in a particularly excited voice. He did not let go of her hand. At this moment, Lan Yu wasn't important anymore. She had already made her choice. The car stopped in the car park of the hospital. Cher was about to get out of the car when her hand was held. Then his warm body covered hers and without her noticing he hugged her. His voice was deep. "Cher, I'm sorry. And, thank you. Sorry for his helplessness and giving up. Thank you for her understanding and returning to his side." Chapter 2374. Being hugged by him, Cher pursed her lips. After a long time she said in a low voice, "It's okay." She said in a very low voice, "It's all in the past. Brother, it's all in the past." He didn't say anything but just hugged her for a full 5 minutes. When he finally let go, he said in a low voice, "Don't leave my sight in the future." "Bossy." Her voice was delicate and soft. It was killing him. Yi Muyun looked at his watch and smiled. "Okay, it's time to go up and see Lan Yu." When they got out of the car together, he naturally held her little hand without any hesitation. Along the way, the staff of Xingyuan Hospital stared at him. Did Mr. Yi and little Princess Tang get back together again? When they reached the elevator, Cher struggled and said in a low voice, "It's better to keep a low profile. Are you afraid that Lan Yu will be sad?" He didn't let go of her little hand and held it very tightly. Cher had no choice but to look up at the top of the elevator. When the elevator door opened, she snorted. Bossy. Yi Muyun had endured all the criticism. Anyway, as long as it hurt Lan Yu, it was all worth it. When they reached the door of the ward, the doctor happened to come out. When he saw Yi Muyun, he briefly explained Lan Yu's condition. Lan Yu's condition? Mr. Yi, it's not looking good. Cher was stunned for a moment and immediately asked, "What's wrong with him?" Yi Muyun patted her little hand to comfort her and then looked at the doctor. What happened? When Lan Yu woke up yesterday, he saw that Lan Yu still looked like he was about to recover. The doctor hesitated for a moment, probably thinking about what to say, and then said, Mr. Lan was also injured at that time. The nerves in his leg were compressed and there was no treatment for it for a long time. So, it's very likely that one of his legs will never be able to stand again. There was a trace of shock in Cher's eyes. If he couldn't stand again, did it mean that She didn't want to think about that possibility. But she was actually clear that that possibility was real. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything for a long time, but her little face was a little pale. Even Yi Muyun was a bit startled, but he quickly regained his senses and said indifferently, "You guys form a group of experts. If that doesn't work, then invite experts from abroad to come and treat Mr. Lan Yu's leg." The doctor was a little surprised. Wasn't Lan Yu and their Mr. Yi the rival in love? If Lan Yu's leg was disabled, how could he compete with Mr. Yi? So how could he compete with Mr. Yi? Therefore, a successful man with this state of mind, this mindset, this heart was all big. The doctor nodded and smiled. Yes, I understand, Chairman Yi. Yi Muyun gestured for him to leave first before turning to look at Shuier. Are you satisfied now? Cher lowered her head. What if it can't be cured? He reached out and caressed her long hair, his voice hoarse. You have to believe that Lan Yu relies on his talent and not his looks. Just his talent alone has countless women throwing themselves at him. Cher widened her eyes and turned her head away, ignoring him. She walked to the door of the ward and stood there for a long time before she plucked up the courage to push the door open. The moment she pushed it open, a plate flew towards her, accompanied by an angry shout from Lan Yu, "Scram!" Chapter 2375. Cher froze on the spot and forgot to dodge. If Yi Muyun hadn't pulled her away, she would have been hit on the forehead. When she calmed down, she saw Lan Yu sitting on the hospital bed and throwing a tantrum at the nurses. Get out of my way. I want to be discharged. The two nurses' eyes were watery as they comforted him. Mr. Lan, this is only temporary. Our attending doctor will find a way to treat him. Are you trying to feed me chicken soup? Lan Yu narrowed his eyes and looked at the nurses. I'll say it for the last time. Get out. The two nurses' eyes were filled with tears. They rolled back and forth but didn't fall. Cher watched from the door. She couldn't believe that the person in front of her was Lan Yu. In the past, Lan Yu was gentle and reserved. He almost never lost his temper and had always been gentle. However, the man in front of her was full of hostility and irritation like a wild beast. Coupled with his untrimmed hair, he looked like a raging lion. She looked at him quietly. Lan Yu looked up and saw her. His angry gaze slowly darkened. He just stared at her like that, as calm as the sea and as unfathomable as it was. Snow's lips moved slightly and she called out, Lan Yu. Lan Yu was still looking at her. After a long time he laughed at himself. Why did you come to see me? Shouldn't I? Cher's voice was very soft. She turned back to look at Yi Muyun and asked with difficulty, Can I talk to him alone for a while? Yi Muyun looked at her calmly and nodded. Of course. The two nurses were stunned. They reminded her instinctively, Miss Tang, Mr. Lan Yu is emotionally unstable right now. We are afraid that. Lan Yu's eyes were bloodshot. He glared at the two nurses. Will I eat her up? The two nurses didn't dare to say a word. Then they ran out in despair. Cher walked past them and closed the door quietly. When she closed the door, she saw the look on Yi Muyun's face. There was no one else like that expression on his face. She mouthed, petty. He naturally knew what she was talking about and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This little bastard. She wanted to be alone with a man, so why couldn't he be jealous? He closed the door and shook his head. He leaned against the door and looked at the young nurse. Why aren't you leaving? The two nurses looked at Mr. Yi and sighed in their hearts. Mr. Ye's heart was really big. However, they didn't dare to stay and just left. Yimuyun looked at their backs and leisurely took out a cigarette from his pocket. He calmly lit it, his eyes a little deep. In the ward, Cher pursed her lips and slowly approached Lan Yu. Lan Yu glared at her. His expression wasn't friendly. He snorted coldly. Are you here to see me because you pity me? Cher finally came to his side. She lowered her eyes and her lips trembled slightly. However, she didn't say a word. Lan Yu suddenly pushed her away and threw something at the door. With a loud thud, it landed on the door and slid to the ground, letting out an ear-piercing shattering sound. Yimuyun was smoking outside the door. Naturally, he heard the shattering sound. His body froze for a moment before he continued smoking as though he didn't hear it. Inside the room, Cher bit her lips. She was shocked. Chapter 2376. What else can I do? Lan Yu sneered. What else do you think a cripple like me can do? He smiled mockingly. Or do you think I can get that nurse into my bed? Cher frowned and said, You're not that kind of person. You're not allowed to talk about yourself like that. Lan Yu chuckled. You think too highly of me, Miss Tang. He paused and looked at her with a gloomy gaze. He said word by word, That's the kind of person I am. Can't you tell? Cher recalled Yimuyun's words and coughed. You're talented. Lan Yu looked at her. His gaze was so dark that she couldn't help but tremble at the sight of it. He said, Tang Cher, do you know me? Do you know my past? Do you know how many women I've used and slept with on my way to success? He narrowed his eyes and sneered, I even like my own sister. I'm a complete pervert. No, you're not. Cher said anxiously, You're not? She squatted down, grabbed one of his hands and placed it on her chest. She looked up at him seriously, looking at the man she had lived with for years. This man had saved her before. Even though she knew it was all a conspiracy, she couldn't hate him. Because she knew that he would be in more pain than she was after all of this. You're not. Lan Yu, you have the ability to love. She looked at him with gentleness in her eyes. You love me, don't you? You're not as cold-hearted as you think you are, and you're not as dark as you think you are. You can walk out of it just like how I was back then. Lan Yu lowered his eyes and looked at her little face. There was no expression on his face. She couldn't tell what he was thinking at that moment. He looked at her like this for a long time and suddenly smiled darkly. At this time, Lan Yu's hair was a little messy. His beard had grown long and he hadn't shaved for a long time. His cheeks were sunken because of his thinness. He looked very different from before. Especially when he smiled like this, he looked especially cold. Cher was a little uneasy, but she didn't run away. Instead, she held his hand tightly. Lan Yu leaned forward. His gloomy face was close to hers and his voice was gloomy and hoarse. Well, you want to save me, don't you? He leaned close to her little face and smiled a little strangely. Leave him and be with me. Snow's lips quivered as she stared at him helplessly. Lan Yu chuckled and said mockingly, Since you've chosen to be with him, why do you still care about what I do? Scram as far as you can. As he shouted, the veins on Lan Yu's forehead bulged. He looked extremely shocked. He pushed her away and his face was back to its previous ruthlessness. Cher fell to the side and looked at him with pursed lips. There was a look of disbelief on her face. Lan Yu's body leaned toward her. One of his legs wasn't nimble, so he leaned toward her. However, he lost his balance and flipped off the bed, falling on top of her. Cher screamed and instinctively supported Lan Yu, not letting his leg fall on her. Chapter 2377. Her face was being squeezed and it hurt. She felt as though the thin layer of skin was about to deform. She gritted her teeth and said in a low voice, Lan Yu, can you be rational? He was still smiling strangely. You said that my wife ran away with me and I still have to be rational, huh? Cher gritted her teeth. Lan Yu, it's impossible between us. If it's impossible, then scram. Don't be a saint. He said viciously before propping himself up with one leg, trying his best to climb back onto the bed. However, he was simply too weak and fell back down the moment he lifted his body. This time around he fell heavily at the side. Cher wanted to help him up, but her hand was grabbed by him and he threw her aside heavily. He looked at her and laughed coldly. See that? I don't even have the strength to climb back onto the bed. Tang Cher, why are you still pestering me? Are you here to watch me make a fool of myself? Cher knelt at the side and bit her lip. Her face was full of vulnerability, but the words that came out of her mouth were infuriating. That's right, I'm here to watch you make a fool of yourself. Not only today but tomorrow and the day after. I'll be here every day from now on to watch you make a fool of yourself. Lan Yu's face was turning green with anger. He glared at her and roared, "Scram." Fine. Cher pursed her lips. Also, I won't call the nurse for you. Just sit on the floor. His face was now dark as he glared at her. Tang Cher, help me to the bed now. Cher took a step back and laughed lightly. I'm here to watch you make a fool of yourself. Why should I help you to the bed? If you want to go up, you can climb up yourself. You still have one leg, don't you? Lan Yu's face was dark as he glared at her. If looks could kill, Lan Yu would have already done so. At this moment the door opened. It wasn't Yi Muyun who opened the door but Lan Yu's parents. As soon as the door was opened, the situation in the ward shocked everyone, especially Lan Yu's parents who were distressed. He rushed in and glared at Cher angrily. He's already in such a state and you're still treating him like this. Are you even human? Blue Mother in particular wants to fan in the past with a slap. Her hand is caught by Yi Muyun. His voice is very heavy. Mrs. Lan, this is not your wild place. Mrs. Lan gritted her teeth and looked up at Yi Muyun. Chairman Yi, I know you're very powerful in B City and can cover the sky with one hand, but my son became like this in order to save this woman. Can't I even hit him? Yi Muyun's gaze was as deep as water. Mrs. Lan, have you forgotten who hit Cher? Your daughter committed a crime, so your son has to pay the price. Isn't that fair? In one sentence he touched Mrs. Lan's pain point. Mrs. Lan's voice was sharp and harsh. What about my Ting Ting? In New York she jumped off a building for you. Don't you feel it at all? Shui Er was stunned for a moment, but Yi Muyun gently pulled her into his embrace. He looked at Mrs. Lan, smiled softly and pursed his thin lips. Mrs. Lan, do I have to be responsible if she likes me? What does it have to do with me? Besides, is she dead? Mrs. Lan's face was pale and she couldn't say a word. Yi Muyun continued to sneer. Her final death is because of Lan Yu's twisted love, indulgence of her, and your indulgence of her. Yi Muyun paused for a moment and continued, don't put your own pot on others. Chapter 2378. Mrs. Lan was so angry that her whole body was shaking. She pointed at Yi Muyun and said, get out of here. Don't come here again. She kept saying, Lan Yu, let's transfer to another hospital, okay? We don't live here anymore. Yes, they want to murder you just like they did to Ting Ting. Blue Mother said, kneeling on the ground. She didn't even know what she said. She just kept saying, they want to kill you, they want to hurt you, Lan Yu. Have you forgotten Ting Ting? Don't you like Ting Ting best? She muttered to herself many times and Lan Yu closed his eyes slightly. Cher was also stunned. The Lan family knew that Lan Yu liked Lan Ting? Then when she returned to B City, what was the meaning of their kindness? He was a fool. She bit her lip and her face was a little pale. Yi Muyun reached out and pressed her in his arms so that she wouldn't hear it. She didn't need to know these dark things. At this time Lan Yu used up his last strength. Enough. Blue Mother was stunned. She couldn't believe that this was what her son said. Her son helped others to talk about her? Her voice was a little sad. Lan Yu, Ting Ting is dead. She is dead. Wake up, okay? Lan Yu stared at her, his face tense, his entire person exuding a frightening aura. He gritted his teeth and said coldly, yes, she's dead. But Mom, I'm not the only one who had such a ridiculous dream all these years. It was their family's abnormal love that brought Lan Ting to the current situation. After Lan Yu finished speaking, Mo's mother's face turned pale. She didn't want to accept such a fact. At the beginning they knew that Lan Yu liked Lan Ting and had always doted on Lan Ting. After Lan Ting jumped off a building, the doctor found that she was mentally ill. Lan Yu was determined to send her to treatment, but how could Lan Yu's mother be willing to send her to treatment? Did sending her to treatment mean admitting that the Lan family had a neurosis? This was something she absolutely could not accept. After that, Lan Ting led a befuddled life. Lan Yu also ran off to learn painting. This family was once thought to be hopeless. However, Lan Yu brought back the beautiful Tang Sher and Xiao Yishu. The old couple had always thought that God was kind to the Lan family and they finally had descendants. It turned out that everything was an ill-fated relationship. Lan Yu, are you worthy of your sister? Mrs. Lan burst into tears. You saved this woman and gave up your sister. Cher's body nestled in Yi Muyun's arms, gently trembling. Although she already knew all of this, she was still hurt when she was openly torn apart by others. She lay in Yi Muyun's arms, trembling like an injured little beast. As for Lan Yu, he was lying on the ground looking ugly and pathetic. His eyes were fixed on her. Seeing how clean she was and himself, Lan Yu smiled softly, and his smile was a little sad. He didn't even know when he had fallen in love with her. If it wasn't for the car accident, he would probably never admit it to himself. Cher's gaze met Lan Yu's. He was so pathetic and the pain in his eyes was so clear. The softest part of her heart felt like it had been hit. During those 5 years when she was on the verge of death, Lan Yu had reached out and carried Yishu. Those ordinary days, his gentle care. It was like a net that covered her, making it hard for her to breathe. Chapter 2379. She took a few steps forward and knelt down, supporting Lan Yu's arm and shoulder with one hand. He was thin to begin with, and now that he was sick he was even lighter. Although she was weak, she could actually support him. Lan Yu was stunned. Looking at her face that was inches away from him, his throat tightened. Tang Sher, what are you doing? I'm saving a jerk. Cher gritted her teeth and glared at him. Lan Yu narrowed his eyes. Do you think you're a savior? Scram back to Yi Muyun's side. Of course I have to scram back, but before that I want to see how you're going to suffer a fate worse than death to reattach your broken leg. Cher scoffed. Lan Yu almost exploded. His messy hair was all standing up and his thin face was filled with shock. He continued to stare at Snow, his voice hoarse as he said, Do you want to see how miserable I am? Yes. Cher's voice was relaxed. You can think of it as a woman's heart. Lan Yu looked up and looked at Yi Muyun, saying almost pathetically, Take your woman away. Mr. Yi stood there elegantly. His handsome appearance was worlds apart from Lan Yu. Lan Yu pursed his lips and looked at the man in front of him, suddenly feeling a little dazzled. Those dark thoughts blotted out the sky and covered the earth, pressuring him to the point he was almost unable to breathe. Only when he sobered up did he understand that it was jealousy. Yes, he was jealous that Yi Muyun could get all of her love and innocence. It would be a lie to say that he didn't regret it. If he had been ruthless that day, he would have gotten her. However, he was also glad that he didn't force himself on her. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to stand in front of her now. Yi Muyun chuckled. Usually I won't object to what she wants to do. Lan Yu was stunned. Then Yi Muyun raised his hand and several security guards appeared at the door. Take Mr. and Mrs. Lan away. In the future, no one is allowed to enter this VIP ward without my approval. Yi Muyun's voice was especially indifferent. Whatever she wants to do, even if it's nonsense, I will fulfill her wish. Lan Yu was completely stunned. Cher was also stunned. She slowly turned her head and looked at Yi Muyun. He was just pretending. When did he become so generous? It was simply to anger Lan Yu. However, she needed his help. No matter how angry she was, she didn't say anything. Mrs. Lan was carried out by the security guards like a chicken. She screamed, Let me go, you bastards. I am Lan Yu's mother. Why can't I see my son? I will call the police and arrest you lawless people. The doctor was at the side, expressionless. Because Mr. Lan is not in a good state now, it's not appropriate to visit. Mrs. Lan screamed, You bastards, I'm going to sue you. You're trying to murder my son. Go ahead. The doctor smiled slightly and made a gesture of go ahead to her and then said softly, The police will come here for at least half an hour, and this half an hour is enough for us to do a lot of things. For example, a needle can make people completely insane. Of course, the police will let you take Mr. Lan Yu back. But we can't guarantee that he's still a good patient. Blue Mother's face changed again and finally it was completely black. She broke her mouth and scolded, You quack. Chapter 2380. Motherland's eyes went black and she fainted as soon as she rolled her eyes. Yimuyun looked at Lan Yu, stepped forward and supported Lan Yu to the hospital bed. Then he looked at Cher and said, "Go back first. If you want to come, you can come every day." Then he looked at Lan Yu and said lightly, "It's up to you whether you want to be depressed or be the original you. However, Cher is obsessed with appearance. She probably won't like your current appearance." After he finished speaking, Lan Yu looked up at him and met the cold and noble Yimuyun's gaze. For a moment no one spoke. Cher looked at this and that, but she didn't dare to say anything. Finally, Yimuyun grabbed her little hand and said, "Let's go home first," she said. After taking 2 steps, she couldn't help but look back at Lan Yu. Yimuyun didn't turn around. He just said softly, "Lan Yu, I'll give you a chance to compete fairly." After a pause, he chuckled and said, "The premise is that you take care of yourself." Lan Yu was so angry that his face was dark. Cher turned around and said in a low voice, "When did you become so annoying?" Mr. Yi said proudly, "I've been generous enough." Her little hand secretly pulled his palm and asked carefully, "Can I really choose again?" Yimuyun snorted and said, "What do you think?" Anyway, he didn't have anything to worry about with Lan Yu's appearance. Cher said cautiously, "What if you recover?" Yimuyun stopped and looked at her coldly. "You said I could choose again." She bit her lip, but there was a touch of mischief in her eyes. Yimuyun looked at her eyes and felt angry and funny. He reached out and rubbed her hair and snorted, "Idiot. If you call me an idiot one more time, I'll be with Lan Yu." Cher pursed her lips and threatened softly. Mr. Yi looked at Lan Yu and smiled faintly. "All right, you can go now." With Lan Yu's current state, she probably couldn't bring herself to do it. As he spoke, the little man hung on his arm, refusing to come down, and went out. Lan Yu was left lying there. He knew that he had already lost. It was not because of his looks or his legs, but because there had never been a place for anyone else between Yimuyun and Tang Cher. He propped himself up, looked at the button beside the bed and pressed it. 5 minutes later the doctor came in and smiled. "Mr. Lan, it seems that you've thought it through and want to receive treatment, right?" Lan Yu's eyes were gloomy and he did not speak. "Sigh, if I were Mr. Lan with such a reputation and so many properties of the Lan family, I would try my best to stand up, wouldn't I?" The doctor's smile was not like that of a doctor. He held a book in his hand and said faintly, "From today onwards, we'll start with a recovery injection. However, it might be a little painful." Lan Yu looked up at the doctor. He was a male doctor, but his face was unbelievably pale and he looked like a gigolo. So effeminate. Lan Yu looked down on such a doctor from the bottom of his heart, so he said with a sullen face, "I want to change doctors." "Change doctors? I'm sorry, but I have the final say in Xinyuan Hospital." The doctor smiled meaningfully. "I forgot to tell you, my surname is Qin. I'm Mr. Ye's younger brother." Lan Yu's face darkened. "Tinamo? Impossible." You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.